In the city of Rome, 4000 BC, one man asked the question, what does it take to truly become great? Is it March yet? No. Quick, I gotta show you something. Civilization 6 is a historical simulator, but unlike other historical games, there's no mode to relive previous empires. So in this video, I'll be playing as Rome on a huge Europe true start location map, with the goal of recreating the borders of the Roman Empire. But there's a twist. I have to complete my challenge before anyone wins any of the other victory types. So will I be able to conquer over 70 cities before turn 220? Well, smash that like button and sit back as Caesar achieves his dreams of conquering the Roman world. Brutus too? Yes, it was quite the party. After the founding of the city of Rome, Caesar began training his troops in tactics, turning them into one of the most disciplined forces in the ancient world. But training without experience can only achieve so much. And after a barbarian tribe was spotted west minding their business, this was a perfect opportunity for Caesar, who set out to defeat them for the glory of Rome. He would have to be quick, however, as at the same time a barbarian scout was intercepted in the southern peninsula. And with such dangerous people so close to their homeland, failure could not be afforded. The barbarians were well fortified in their camps, but through elite Roman discipline, the western slinger fled the encampment, which was now occupied by Caesar's forces. But this would only prove to be a false victory, as this entire battle was a trap. And after baiting us into the camp, they began pelting our forces, but the training of Caesar's forces proved too strong to overcome, allowing the army to rally and counterattack, claiming victory over the Occitanian barbarians. The clan was looted for over 330 gold, which was promptly sent back to Rome, who used this gold to purchase a settling expedition to further expand Rome's influence. This city was placed in a key location so that any enemy coming from the west could never again threaten Rome without taking the Aquila fortress. The construction of this new fortification was overseen by Caesar, who now moves to deal with the southern encampment. The Romans soon found themselves outnumbered, but because of their superior training and fortification, they managed to hold the line. But despite this battle taking place in the south of Italy, the ancient world struggled with logistics, and to keep up the supplies of the southern army, a third supply node was settled. And this is when I figured out that there was no iron on the map. At all. There was now iron on the map, which would soon be effectively used as the southern army was able to overwhelm the defenders and force them to hand over their valuables. But while the gold caravans were making their way back to Rome, French forces were spotted crossing the Alps, and they weren't going back home. Despite the non-zero chance they just wanted to escape France, like most of us would, an experienced Caesar was called back to Rome. In the city, he began training an army, and with the defense of the peninsula set up, this was shaping up to be a bloody battle. But Caesar had something no one else had: experience. And through his constant drilling and new tactics learned from his expeditions, he was able to utilize the new resource, iron, to upgrade his warriors into a more effective fighting force, the Legion. After witnessing such a startling force, the French army retreated and would never again siege the Italian peninsula. But with all these resources thrown into their new army and expenses not looking so great, the Senate decided that a punitive expedition was necessary. And who better to lead that invasion than the general who was able to force the French to withdraw in the first place? But there was a catch. This was a punitive expedition, and to achieve his dreams of conquest, how do we keep the Senate on our side? Give me some more of that black, please. It's crack. And after Catherine ordered fortifications on the Alps, Caesar began his assault on their army. But despite Catherine's claims of Nostradamus being unable to predict this, I don't see it. Stephen Hawking without the chair would have been able to figure this out. Regardless, her surprise doesn't change the fact that our nations were now at war, and the first battle of the Alps would prove decisive. With the fact that the legions were so well trained, they performed acrobatics while equipped with heavy armor. The battle was a victory, as the Romans secured access to the French lowlands and protection of Italy. But this war wasn't going to go completely Rome's way. With no home defense, France attacks from the east, and if we lose the city of Aquileia, we will be completely cut off from Caesar. And so one of our brightest generals ends up as commander of the rapid response forces and is ordered to stop the eastern incursion, allowing Caesar's legions to push forward unperturbed towards the city of Nantes. As they move in, nothing but the best of French defenders comes out to face them. He thinks he's Sifu, get him boys! While the Nantes front was going well, Aquileia was going less so. The warrior is forced to retreat, leaving nothing to stop them from advancing on the city's weak eastern front. But hope wasn't lost yet, especially when Nantes was surrounded by Caesar's elite forces. And through their superior training, they prevented a French flanking attempt easily before storming the city in the next turn. But Catherine hasn't given up yet. Her use of secret agents leads to organized resistance, which could lead to rebellions, despite installing a governor into the city. But with the city at least temporarily under their control, reinforcements could be sent south to eliminate the enemy's invasion attempt. While the rest of the army was ordered to move forward, and with Paris in sight, the army was ordered to launch an all-out assault. And with no defenses set up after the disastrous counterattack at Nantes, nothing but Sifu could have stopped the city from falling. While taking Paris wasn't too much of an accomplishment, the issue was always going to be the loyalty of the city, and to fix that, all French resistance had to be eliminated, and so the next target was Rouen out west. And while the French weren't exactly an effective fighting force anymore, Catherine still had hope that her plans titled Operation Black Queen would save her yet. And the next step to that plan was moving out her settler as bait. This valuable unit was taken by the Romans, but this only led to more time passing, allowing the Parisian resistance movement to further strengthen. And while the city of Rouen would no doubt fall soon, the lack of effectiveness of the Roman administration through drug-induced loafing meant that the nation's economy was in shambles, and nothing encourages rebellion more than a poor, starving populace who are given a way out by Black Queen's secret forces. This rebellion was cataclysmic, as the Romans not only faced a two-front war, but the French also established sleeper cells in the previously rooted out Nantes. To prevent themselves from getting surrounded, the siege of Rouen was rushed. But with Caesar needing all his forces to retake Paris, he would have to hope the pitiful garrison would be able to keep order until he put down the Paris rebellion. And through incredible speed and a flanking maneuver, the French capital was taken and forcibly oppressed once again. But while French power was crippled, the lack of loyalty to the Roman overlords meant that the embers of revolution, especially in France, could soon reignite if the German tribes from the east gave their support. And so off to Germany the Romans went. This insubordination enraged the Senate, who was worried about Caesar breaking the law and exercising dictatorial powers. Tell him to return, Germany's too far. How about a buy one, get one free? But even with the Senate high off the good stuff, Caesar still had to prepare for his incursion to deal with the warlike Germanic people. However, he had a plan. Through establishing an oligarchic military command, he was able to increase the effectiveness of his fighting forces. But while he was preparing, a new danger emerged from the northern Alps. But until then, the established military tradition of the Roman army, where each individual soldier had complete confidence in the man on either side of him, powered the Romans through the city of Amboise and opened themselves up to face the combined French barbarian force. This is Catherine's final gambit, hoping that the barbarian invaders bolstering her army could force the Romans to sue for peace. But what she failed to realize was that you'd have an easier time finding black people at a ski resort than finding a single barbarian after Caesar came through. And while this elimination was complete, they were fortified on mountain slopes, and so the time spent dealing with it was wasteful, allowing the North German alliance led by Frederick, who was overseeing Roman tactics, to prepare countermeasures of his own. But as for now, the large Roman army was preparing for the invasion of the final French stronghold, when a bright young general that proved herself joined the retinue of Caesar under orders of the Civilifer, and together they surrounded and destroyed the last French city before capturing Catherine, who didn't need Nostradamus to tell her that all hope was lost. But not all fights would prove this easy, and with the rest of Europe and North Africa to plow through, this fight was far from over, especially with the not inconceivable possibility that all these military successes could end up getting to Caesar's head. But for now, his genius was unquestioned, and with France gone, there was some time to prepare before moving on to Frederick's cities. Time that was spent giving the elite of Caesar's forces distinction. Amongst them, the Jakarta Jelkers, Schwerer Panzerbewagen Sonderkuftabfahrt, and the 6th grade drug lords receiving particular distinction. As our troops, now completely loyal to Caesar, were ordered to move in on the Germans. But as our forces invaded the north, Frederick had an ace up his sleeve. His bevy of ranged attackers performed hit-and-run tactics which were brutal to our troops. These archers not only slowed down our advance considerably, but with the Poles invading from the east, we wouldn't be able to completely subdue the Germans, as the spoils would have to be shared with the enemy of our enemy. But nonetheless, these tactics didn't prevent the capture of Heidelberg, which, I would like to state for the record, was burned to the ground by our angry troops. But the problems we faced in this former city persisted in Frankfurt. Despite the heavy casualties inflicted upon us by ranged units, the Germans were also fighting a two-front war, in which the Poles had just captured their capital of Aachen, and so the remaining Roman forces stormed their way into Frankfurt, eliminating the German Empire. But this was an incomplete victory, as the Poles had something that Caesar wanted, which you can imagine was taken well by the Senate. Tell him to return. Poland's too far. I didn't want to have to do this. Have you guys ever heard of fentanyl? While Caesar began preparing forces to march eastward, he took this respite to upgrade his soldiers' weaponry and armor. These new men-at-arms would prove far more effective than the traditional legion, which would be important against the Poles, who deployed a never-before-seen weapon. But while his generals tried to convince him to split his forces to aid the invasion from the south, Caesar had a better idea. Good old frontal assaults, they never fail! And with such an advanced and well-trained army, who needs operational planning? But would the rest of Poland prove just as easy, especially when they began rolling out their secret weapon? The catapult. Yes, in fact, it would be that easy. But some of our younger generals saw potential in these ranged contraptions. However, the idea was soon struck down by Caesar as Polish magic, and despite their decent damage, the superior Roman army would bash themselves against the walls of Gdansk until they finally took the city. But Boudica had proven herself in this campaign, as she was given command of the majority of the army, while Caesar would support the beleaguered southern army, who was led by, well, apparently the man who ordered the charge at the Somme if this situation is taken at face value. This emergency, coupled with the flanking maneuver by Byzantium's catapults, which proved particularly effective against cities, emboldened Boudica, who decided to take the initiative. And Caesar was greeted with a pleasant surprise after he was able to finish off the city of Warsaw. But despite first-hand accounts on the effectiveness of siege weaponry, Caesar stuck to his guns when he came back to finish the siege of Krakow. And with the Polish capital taken, the emergency was deemed a success, and after definitely not implementing a puppet government of the Polish and German lands that were now supposed to be freed, he saw something unsettling. Constantinople didn't settle the strait? This means war! And also I'm taking the rest of Poland because, well, they're Poland. If I don't, somebody else will. But at this point, you would think enough is enough, and that the Senate themselves would order Caesar back home, freeing Poland in the process. Well, with widespread crack sales ruining the Roman economy, who despite their size was still weaker than the more compact Byzantine Empire, mainly due to the fact that the only senator who was still sober enough to make decisions was the cause of this ruin, left Caesar with free reign at this point to do whatever he wanted. And after eliminating the rest of the Polish realm in a single turn, Caesar thought himself as a military genius on par with Alexander, and was in no way proceeding with caution or changing his battle strategies, despite the fact that the Byzantine Empire was just as powerful as the Romans. And so all forces, including the newly trained assassin named Ezio, was ordered to move on the Byzantine realm. To aid this invasion, a forward base was settled where all soldiers were upgraded into man-at-arms and drilled in Caesar's fairly simplistic tactics. But Thessaloniki had a problem. They were building medieval walls, a complete counter to battering rams. There wasn't much time left, and while the Romans were charging the still fortifying city, they discovered that Basil himself had men-at-arms just as strong as the Romans. Caesar wanted every soldier he had to storm the city before they could complete their fortifications. This reckless abandon against a peer rival cost the Romans a valuable man-at-arms unit. But this didn't bother Caesar in the slightest, as his reckless orders did eventually lead to the capture of the city. But at what cost? The city wasn't exactly loyal, which necessitated continuing the campaign into the Battle of Edessa Edessa, with a now upgraded siege tower. But there was a key factor that Caesar was missing. Basil was a genius. With his taxis, intelligence gathering from spies and diplomatic visibility, brilliant use of siege support, and his people's beliefs in Basil as the defender of the faith, they more than held their ground as they caused a fatal casualty against one of Rome's best units, the Jakarta Jelkers. But while his forces were more than a match for Rome's, the Romans still had the numbers, and were eventually able to secure control of Edessa. But while in previous campaigns the forces of the losing army would retreat in a panic, Basil was able to orchestrate a strategic withdrawal to fight another day in Kherson. But despite this, Basil would soon make his first vital mistake in this war. Boudicca had convinced Caesar to test out new range support of their own, and in an ill-advised counteroffensive, this unit was key in dwindling Basil's forces. With an opening revealing itself, the Romans moved on to Kherson, making sure to settle another supply point in Greece as the barbaric natives were harassing the supplies being shipped to the army. Finally, with nothing prepared, the Romans launched their assault on Kherson and realized that the city was too fortified, with walls beyond their comprehension. The poorly thought out invasion was shaping up to be a Teutoburg disaster for the Romans, who were left stranded in enemy territory. Thankfully, the general Boudicca, learning from Basil himself, was able to organize an effective retreat and saved the Roman army. But despite this minor success, the reality of Renaissance walls, casualties, and a southern barbarian threat forced the Roman Senate to sign a humiliating peace with the Byzantines. With such a disaster having occurred, Caesar has to find a way to punch through Basil's fortifications, but this time without funding from home, as he began reading up on the tactics his enemies used during previous military campaigns. Because with such a demoralized and weakened army halted by Basil, action had to be taken. But if they made a move on the second Rome, the southern barbarians could cripple them from the flanks, and so had to be dealt with. This is where Boudicca comes in. After convincing Caesar to take El Cid, a promising officer under his command, she would deal with these barbarians herself, who organizes a coup in the southern Greek states as Caesar keeps his word. But that's not everyone Caesar decided to adapt from. The earlier Germanic incursions utilized strong ranged attackers to keep the Romans at bay. But what if they were stronger? Sending a letter to Rome to see if they could aid him in his plans, but the Senate wasn't exactly friendly and was ordering Caesar to return home. At least until the Civ Lifer came up with a brilliant ploy. You get the Navy, you get the military-industrial complex, you get a monopoly in the hot air balloon industry. These promises of corrupt gains not only calmed the Senate, but also aided Caesar, as the new niter resource was used to equip soldiers with flintlock muskets. That's not the only explosive weapon under his ranks. The Byzantines and Poles before them used siege weaponry to destructive effect. But what if you replaced stones with explosive cannons? These more effective weapons not only dealt considerable damage from a distance, but would be strong enough to penetrate the stout fortifications around Kherson. This newfound innovation and reform empowered the Roman middle class, which would soon pay dividends to the prestige and strength of the empire. But despite these successes, not all news was good. Edessa had rebelled, but instead of stubbornly retaking the city, Caesar realized the populace so close to Kherson was untenable, and burned it to the ground, preventing Basil from hiding his spies amongst the populace. With preparations made, war crimes committed, and forces upgraded, Caesar launches his second invasion. But this wasn't the end of his preparations. In the Straits of Constantinople, he utilizes a strategy that Catherine had taught him in the Alps, harassing enemy reinforcements attempting to cross over, slowing down aid in conjunction with Special Agent Ezio, allowing the Roman army to surround the city. But despite this planning, another unnamed unit was nearly lost. However, through sheer determination of will, he survived and was named accordingly. This was as close as Byzantium would get to a break, as without aid, Kherson finally surrendered, and remnants were mopped up. After securing his logistics and reorganizing his command structure, the Romans began their march on Constantinople, and and the entire reason this war was started, with its terrible strait placement. This is when the spy in Constantinople established itself and fed information on enemy movements, allowing the Romans to fortify strategic passages and prevent reinforcements from entering the city. With these plans, the city of the world's desire didn't stand a chance. But that wasn't the end of Basil, as the hilly terrain of Anatolia was Caesar's biggest challenge yet. But due to a certain monopoly, he soon had all the observation balloons his bombards would ever need, leaving Nicomedia in a hopeless situation as the Roman forces were defeated in detail, leaving no one to defend Basil's last stronghold of Antioch and finally merging the two Romes. But despite this success, the incoming Dark Age had the potential to spell disaster and not only halt all military advancement, but also cause the newly captured cities to rebel and join the Georgian Empire. The question now was, how would they deal with this impassable mountain range? The top Roman engineers who wanted to test their new warplanes began construction on a flying fortress. But while they would have to wait on that, the new fighter aircraft was more than enough to obliterate the Georgian medieval army. But that still doesn't solve the problem of loyalty issues and guerrilla tactics. As long as the massive Tbilisi stands, Caesar would have no chance of keeping his gains. But despite Caesar wanting to use his new line infantry for another frontal assault, El Cid came up with an ingenious, intricate strategy. Our spies in Tbilisi tell us of a rebellion, so now is our time to make a move. By ignoring rebellions and gunning straight for the capital, these rebellions would no doubt die out. And by splitting the forces into two, the city could be pincered from both mountain passes and forced to surrender. The first pass was secured just as the first rebellions were launching, but Agent Ezio was on the case, moving to deal with the westernmost rebellion single-handedly, leaving Caesar free to take the second pass, as the plan to pincer Tbilisi could now be enacted. But while Ezio was bum-fiddling the rebels, a flying fortress passed overhead. As the new bomber aircraft obliterated Georgia's defenses, the flanking maneuver came through, only to find a city of ruins, as Georgia surrendered after a short fight. But the fight wasn't over yet, as there was cleanup duty to accomplish. But we were prepared for this, as Ezio finished off the rebels, the navy captured southern Georgia, and the army secured the Levant. When success reached back home to Rome, we could double our scientific, cultural, and economic output by taking Egypt. Like you said though, Caesar has to come home at this. No, let him cook. But before they could continue their forays in the kitchen, El Cid talks about the newest discovery, oil, and Caesar decided to enact these plans, purchasing battleships, artillery, and eventually infantry when they would get there. And with his forces ready, they move in on Egypt and another terrible strait in the city of Apu. But the city needed to ensure stability was the powerful Rocket, which would previously be a problem, but the Roman innovation made things trivial as they took the Egyptian capital. However, it wasn't over, and to their dismay they learned that there were more settlements littered across the Nile. Caesar realized that his army of infantry would pass out long before then, and previous cities would rebel before they could take the next, so he had to switch up his strategy. And while he took further lessons of war and implemented them into a new command structure, the first of the Roman tanks began entering service, which spearheaded the Africa campaign, moving down faster than every other unit, and combined with total air dominance, the entirety of Cleopatra's population centers were captured, securing Egypt before the previously taken cities could even begin to organize any rebellions. With such a long and storied military career filled with ups and downs, Caesar was now ready to realize his dreams and counter whatever it is he might face, safe in the knowledge that back home, Civlifer was respected by everyone as their undisputed leader, the one who brought prosperity to the Roman world as the undisputed world hegemon. It was finally time to restore the Roman Empire, but before planning could begin, El Cid announces his retirement, and while Caesar didn't have to, he decided to replace the Spanish general with a promising Corsican. And after taking time to construct a powerful navy, the plans to storm Portugal were finally completed. And with two nations left and the game getting late, Caesar decided mobility had to be valued above all else. And so the infantry infantry that followed him to the ends of the earth would retire their lives to Egyptian luxury, while the new ships, replete with state-of-the-art aircraft carriers and a land army of tanks, made for Western Africa, as he ordered his navy to begin shelling North Africa. At the same time, our spies allowed us full view of the entirety of eastern Iberia, which allowed our air force to bomb the entirety of the east coast. There was also a bit of a funny situation when a warrior army took out a pike and shot, and after a good laugh, the destroyers and tank army eliminated the entirety of eastern Iberia. Such decisive victory enshrined the cult of Caesar, and in his totalitarianism was able to center the entire nation around the military. And so Portugal went from a puncher's chance to no hope of victory at all, as the rest of the peninsula surrendered a few turns later. This is referred to as the starting point of the Roman Golden Age, which some might even call heroic. With Portugal gone, the final nation in the way of Caesar's dream was Scotland, but Mali was also looming large. To focus his efforts entirely on land, the Air Force was given to Napoleon, who decided that Mali and their control of the straits could potentially prevent supplies from making it north, crippling the oil-dependent army. So while Caesar was busy storming the beaches of Scotland, air support was less than expected. But Scotland in their isolation didn't even know what gunpowder was, and Haddington was shell-shocked into submission. While this would normally be the start of a months-long campaign, Caesar decided to halt at defensive terrain dubbed Hadrian's Wall, and while fortifications were being refitted, another isolated empire in Mali lost to Morocco, as supply lines from the capital were finally secured. And after witnessing such a blitzing, the rest of the world's empires were more than willing to bow down to Caesar, who truly became one of the greats and restored the Roman Empire.